Every time my sister got in trouble, she mysteriously found out one of my secrets and told our parents. I thought it was coincidence until I ran an experiment. Growing up in our suburban house with the white picket fence and perfectly manicured lawn, I always felt like I was living in some twisted version of a family sitcom. My sister was a year younger than me, but she had this uncanny ability to wiggle out of any situation that would have landed me grounded for weeks. I'm talking about the kind of manipulation skills that would make seasoned politicians jealous. It all started when I was 15 and she was 14. I remember the exact moment because it was right after I'd gotten my learner's permit and felt like I was finally gaining some independence. She came home that Tuesday with a note from the principal's office. Apparently she'd been caught cheating on a math test. Not just peeking at someone else's paper, but full-on had written formulas on her water bottle label. Mom and Dad were setting up for what looked like it was going to be a serious conversation with her when suddenly, out of nowhere, she mentioned that she'd seen me smoking behind the garage the week before. The shift in the room was instant. Suddenly I was the one being interrogated about where I'd gotten the cigarettes, who I was hanging out with, and whether this was a regular thing. My sister just sat there with this innocent look on her face while I tried to explain that it was just one time, that a friend had offered, and that I didn't even like it. By the time my parents were done lecturing me about lung cancer and peer pressure, her cheating incident had somehow become a footnote in the conversation. I thought it was just bad timing. Like, what are the odds that she'd notice me smoking right when she needed a distraction? But then it happened again, and again. When she got suspended for 3 days for getting into a fight with another girl over some drama that started on social media, that very same evening my parents somehow found out that I'd been skipping my last period study hall to hang out at the local coffee shop with friends. I still don't know how they discovered that one. I'd been so careful, always making sure to get back to school before the final bell, so I could catch my usual bus home. The pattern became so predictable it was almost comical. She'd mess up, and within 24 hours, my parents would confront me about something I thought I'd kept completely private. When she lied about spending the night at a friend's house but actually went to some party where the police showed up, suddenly my parents knew about the girl I'd been texting late at night. When she got caught vandalizing school property with spray paint, they discovered I'd been sneaking out through my bedroom window to meet friends at the park after curfew. Each time, I felt this crushing sense of betrayal and confusion. How did they keep finding out about things I'd never told anyone? I started becoming paranoid, wondering if they'd somehow installed cameras, or if they were reading my text messages. I became more secretive, more withdrawn, constantly looking over my shoulder and second-guessing every decision. The worst part was watching how quickly the spotlight moved off her and onto me. She had this way of presenting my secrets that made them sound so much worse than whatever she'd done. My occasional cigarette became evidence of a dangerous habit that needed immediate intervention. My innocent late-night conversations with a girl from school became a concerning pattern of deceptive behavior that required serious discussion about respect and honesty. Meanwhile, her actual problematic behaviors, the cheating, the fighting, the lying, the property damage, these all got swept under the rug as my parents became consumed with addressing my apparent moral failings. She'd sit there during these family meetings, nodding seriously as they talked about disappointment and consequences, occasionally chiming in with helpful observations about how she'd noticed I seemed to be making poor choices lately. I started to feel like I was going crazy. Was I really such a terrible kid that my behavior was consistently worse than hers? Was I just not seeing my own actions clearly? The constant criticism and lectures were wearing me down, making me doubt myself in ways that went far beyond typical teenage insecurity. Update 1. Things escalated dramatically during my junior year. She'd been caught stealing money from the till at her part-time job at a local boutique. We're talking about nearly $200 over the course of several weeks. The manager had security footage and everything. This wasn't some minor teenage mistake. This was actual theft that could have resulted in serious legal consequences. But somehow, the very next day, my parents discovered my secret Instagram account where I'd been posting pictures from parties and hanging out with friends they didn't approve of. Nothing scandalous, just typical teenage stuff like group photos where people happened to be holding red Solo cups, or pictures from a friend's birthday party that went later than my usual curfew. But the way my sister presented it to them, you'd think I was documenting a life of reckless debauchery. The conversation about her stealing job was postponed indefinitely while my parents focused on what they saw as my double life and dishonesty about my social activities. They took away my phone, implemented a strict curfew, and started requiring detailed itineraries for any time I wanted to leave the house. Meanwhile, she somehow managed to frame her theft as a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the stress of watching her older sibling make such poor choices. That's when I really started paying attention to the timing. It wasn't just coincidence, it was strategic. Every single time she found herself in hot water, within 48 hours maximum, I'd find myself in the crosshairs instead. The precision of it was actually impressive in a disturbing way. I began keeping a mental log of her troubles and my subsequent exposures. When she got written up at her new job for consistently showing up late and having a bad attitude with customers, suddenly my parents learned about the time I'd driven to a friend's house 2 towns over without telling them where I was really going. When she failed a major history project because she'd plagiarized most of it from online sources, they discovered I'd been using a fake ID to get into movies rated for older audiences. The fake ID incident was particularly infuriating because it was such a minor thing. I just wanted to see a horror movie with friends, and I looked young for my age. But the way she revealed it made it sound like I was engaged in serious identity fraud with potentially dangerous implications. I started noticing other patterns too. She had this way of gathering information about me that seemed almost professional. She'd ask seemingly innocent questions about my day, my friends, my plans. She'd volunteer to do my laundry and somehow always ended up finding receipts or notes in my pockets. She'd offer to help clean my room and would subtly investigate my belongings while she was in there. At first, I'd actually appreciated what I thought was her interest in my life and her helpfulness around the house. I thought we were getting closer as siblings, that maybe she was looking up to me and wanted to be more involved in my world. The realization that she was actually conducting reconnaissance missions made me feel sick to my stomach. Update 2. The breakthrough came during the spring of my senior year, when I finally decided to test my theory with a controlled experiment. She'd just been caught lying to our parents about her grades. She'd been forging signatures on failed tests and intercepting emails from teachers for months. The academic dishonesty was so extensive that she was at risk of having to repeat the entire semester. Instead of waiting to see what secret of mine would mysteriously surface, I decided to plant some bait. I casually mentioned to her that I was really stressed because I'd accidentally backed into our neighbor's car in their driveway and left a small dent, but I was too scared to tell anyone about it. I made sure to include just enough detail to make it believable. Which neighbor, what time of day it happened, how I'd been trying to figure out if I should confess or just hope they wouldn't notice. The story was completely fabricated. I'd never damaged anyone's car, never even driven in that particular neighbor's driveway. But I told her about my fictional hit-and-run incident with just the right amount of anxiety and guilt to make it seem genuine. Then I waited. Sure enough, 2 days later, when my parents sat her down for what should have been a serious conversation about her academic deception and the potential consequences for her graduation timeline, she suddenly broke down and said she couldn't handle keeping my secret anymore. Through theatrical tears, she told them about the car incident, expressing how guilty she felt for not encouraging me to do the right thing sooner. The speed with which my parents' attention shifted was almost whiplash-inducing. Suddenly, we were all piling into the car to go examine the neighbor's vehicle, with me trying to figure out how to explain that there was no damage because there had been no accident. The neighbor was confused when we knocked on their door to confess to a crime that had never happened. My parents were bewildered when they couldn't find any evidence of the dent I'd supposedly caused. In that moment, watching my sister's face as she realized she'd been caught in her own trap, everything clicked into place. The confusion in her eyes as she tried to figure out why her tried-and-true method had backfired was almost satisfying. Almost. But the satisfaction was quickly replaced by a deeper sadness as I realized the full scope of what had been happening. This wasn't just opportunistic behavior. This was a systematic campaign that had been going on for years. She had been deliberately collecting information about my private life, storing it up like ammunition, and strategically deploying it whenever she needed to redirect our parents' disappointment and anger. The worst part was recognizing how effective her strategy had been. I'd spent years feeling like a failure, like I was constantly disappointing my parents, like I couldn't do anything right. I'd internalized their criticism and started believing that maybe I really was the problem child in our family. The constant state of being in trouble, of having to defend myself, of feeling like I was walking on eggshells, it had shaped my entire sense of self during those crucial teenage years. When I confronted her about it later that evening, she initially tried to deny it, then shifted to justifying her actions. She claimed that she was just trying to help our parents understand what was really going on with me, that she was concerned about my choices and thought they needed to know. But her explanations fell apart pretty quickly when I pointed out the suspicious timing and asked her to explain how my behavior was somehow always more concerning than her actual documented problems. Update 3. The confrontation with my sister opened up a conversation that I wasn't prepared for. When she finally dropped the pretense, what came out was years of resentment and competition that I hadn't fully recognized. She admitted that she'd felt like I was always the favorite, that our parents had higher expectations for her because they thought I was naturally more responsible and mature. In her mind, my minor rebellions were proof that I wasn't as perfect as everyone thought, and she felt justified in exposing them. But what really threw me was when she broke down and revealed how exhausting it had been to constantly manage our parents' perceptions. She described feeling like she was drowning in their disappointment, like nothing she did was ever good enough, and like the only way to get breathing room was to redirect their focus onto someone else's problems. She'd been so consumed with avoiding their criticism that she'd never learned how to actually address her own issues or mistakes. The manipulation had become such an automatic response that she wasn't even fully conscious of how calculated it had become. What started as panic-driven deflection had evolved into a sophisticated system of information gathering and strategic revelation. She'd created detailed mental files on my activities, friends, and secrets, constantly updating and organizing them for potential future use. Hearing this didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand the psychological pressure she'd been under. Our parents, with their high expectations and intense reactions to disappointment, had inadvertently created an environment where she felt like her only option was to survive by throwing me under the bus. I realized that I needed to address this with our parents not just for my own sake, but because the dynamic was toxic for both of us. The conversation was one of the most difficult I'd ever had with them. I had to explain years of manipulation and deception while also helping them understand how their parenting style had contributed to the problem. Initially, they were defensive and skeptical. The idea that their younger daughter had been systematically manipulating family dynamics for years was hard for them to accept. But when I walked them through the timeline and the patterns, when I showed them how consistently my troubles coincided with her problems, the evidence became undeniable. The fake car accident experiment was the proof they needed to see that something bigger was going on. They started looking back at years of incidents with new eyes, recognizing how they'd been played and how their responses had reinforced the unhealthy dynamic. Final update. The months that followed were some of the most challenging our family had ever experienced, but also some of the most healing. My parents had to confront the fact that their parenting approach, while well-intentioned, had created an environment where their children felt like they had to compete for approval and manipulate situations to avoid disappointment. They started working on changing their communication style, focusing more on understanding and problem-solving rather than immediate judgment and punishment. When issues came up, instead of launching into lectures about character and consequences, they began asking more questions about what was really happening and what kind of support we needed. My sister had to learn entirely new ways of handling mistakes and problems. For years, her default response to any difficulty had been to find a way to deflect attention and blame onto someone else. Learning to take responsibility, to sit with discomfort, and to work through problems directly was like learning a foreign language for her. The process wasn't smooth. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when we all fell back into old patterns. My sister struggled with the vulnerability required to be honest about her mistakes without having a backup plan to shift focus elsewhere. My parents had to resist their instinct to react strongly to disappointing news and instead create space for honest conversation. For me, the biggest challenge was learning to trust again. Years of having my privacy violated and my secrets weaponized had made me incredibly guarded. I had to slowly open up to the possibility that my family relationships could be different, that I could share aspects of my life without them being used against me later. But gradually, things began to change. My sister started coming to my parents directly when she was struggling, instead of waiting until she was caught in a crisis. She began asking for help with schoolwork before she was failing, talking about social problems before they escalated into major drama, and admitting mistakes before they snowballed into bigger issues. My parents learned to respond to these early conversations with support rather than disappointment. They started seeing problems as opportunities to guide and help rather than as evidence of character flaws that needed to be corrected through punishment and lectures. The transformation wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about building something entirely new. We developed family meeting traditions where we could talk about challenges and concerns before they became emergencies. We created space for both of us to make mistakes and learn from them without fear of harsh judgment or family-wide drama. My relationship with my sister evolved from competitive and suspicious to genuinely supportive. She became someone I could actually confide in, knowing that my trust wouldn't be betrayed the next time she found herself in trouble. I started being able to see her struggles with compassion rather than just frustration and resentment. Looking back now, I can see how the experience taught me valuable lessons about manipulation, trust, and family dynamics that have served me well in other relationships. I learned to recognize when someone is collecting information that could be used against me later, to pay attention to patterns in how people respond to stress and conflict, and to address problems directly rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves. The whole situation also taught me about the importance of creating environments where people feel safe to be honest about their struggles and mistakes. When people feel like honesty will be met with harsh judgment or severe consequences, they naturally look for ways to protect themselves, even if those methods hurt other people. Our family emerged stronger and more connected than we'd ever been, but it required everyone to do the hard work of examining their own behavior and committing to change. The manipulation and deception had been symptoms of deeper communication and trust issues that needed to be addressed systematically over time. The experience changed how I approach relationships and conflict resolution in all areas of my life. I learned that sustainable solutions require addressing root causes rather than just managing symptoms, and that real change happens when people feel safe enough to be vulnerable and honest about their struggles.